What's up guys, Reese here from reese3d.com. In this video, we're going to talk about exposure triangle. So what is an exposure triangle? It is basically three numbers that decides how much light your image or your photograph will have. Now before we get into that, we need to basically understand how a camera works, right? So we have a subject here, and imagine that I'm going to take a photograph of that subject with this camera. What is going to happen is the light that bounces off the subject is basically going into my camera lens, and that light will be converted into an electrical signal when it hits the image sensor that is inside the camera. So the image sensor is going to transfer that electrical signals into an image processor, and the processor will convert that into a JPG file which you can copy into an SD card. So now you understand that getting the right amount of light into your photograph is essential to get the best picture. So now let's get into these three numbers. The first one is aperture. The aperture is something like a window that is sitting at the end of your lens and decides how much amount of light should pass through the lens. The aperture number, which is also called as f number, varies between 22 to 1.4, 1.2, sometimes even 0.9 or 0.8, okay, which is generally mentioned in the lens itself. So in this lens, you can see it says 1.4, which is basically the maximum aperture this lens can have. Now this lens has an aperture range of 16 to 1.4. Now you might think that 16 should be wide open and 1.4 is the narrower or smaller aperture size, but that is wrong. Aperture works in the opposite way. So if you have a higher number, that means it is very close, there's very less amount of light passing through. 1.4 will basically open up more and let more light in. So to put in simple words, the higher aperture number, the less light, and the lower aperture number, the more light. Cool. Let's get into shutter speed. This is a mirrorless camera, so you won't be able to see the shutter unless I take the photo. So watch what happens when I click. Something just closed and opened, right? Let me do it once again. That's the shutter. So the shutter speed basically decides how much time should the door or the shutter should be opened before it closes down. So the faster the shutter speed, the less amount of light will go in. When you look at the shutter speed number, it is 1 divided by a certain number. And the more the number you get, the faster the shutter speed will be. The faster the shutter speed, the less amount of light will pass through. So we talked about aperture, which basically is like a window in your lens, and the shutter is basically a door in your camera. But the third number is ISO. ISO is basically the sensitivity of your image sensor. So I have a mirrorless camera, so you can basically see the sensor right away. So what you're seeing here is basically the image sensor. Okay, so the shiny, beautiful looking thingy is the image sensor. And the image sensor basically has a different amount of sensitivity, so you can basically adjust that value here. The more number means more brighter image. So let's recollect them quickly. Aperture is the window that is inside your lens, which opens up and closes down. The higher the number, the less light will pass through. Shutter speed is the door that is inside your camera, which opens and closes when you click or press the shutter button. And again, the higher the number, the less light will go through. And ISO is the sensitivity of the image sensor, and the more number means more light. Now these three numbers also have another property. So before we get into that, let's set up a scene and look through the camera. All right guys, now we have our scene set up where we have a subject here, we have the camera, and I'm going to control this camera using the software that I have in my laptop. Okay, so that way we can basically watch how the image is changing at the same time looking at what values we have for the shutter speed, for the ISO, and for the aperture. Now this is a cool application that is created by Sony to connect to their Sony digital cameras. So here we can actually use these sliders to change these values digitally. Fine. So watch what happens if I just click on this up arrow. It's actually going to increase the brightness of the image. but at the same time, you will notice that the numbers actually go down. Because this is aperture, let me see if I can just push it all the way. It is going to go up to 1.4, which is the maximum limit of the lens that I have. Now, if I click on this down button, which is basically going to make the image darker, at the same time, you'll notice that the f number or the aperture number goes up. Cool. So you will also notice one other change that is happening along with this. We will look at that in just a minute. Fine. So now let's look at the second one, which is the shutter speed. Okay, so shutter speed, again, if I click on this, it is actually going to make the image look brighter. At the same time, you will also notice that the numbers that you have is getting lower. Okay, so if I go down to make it more darker, you will see that the number goes up. So keep in mind, for aperture and shutter speed, the bigger the number, the darker the image. Cool. Now, let's look at ISO, which is basically 100 now. Let me just increase that to make the image brighter. You will notice that the more number we give, the more brighter the image becomes. So this is basically the sensitivity of the image sensor, and you give a higher sensitivity, the more light it will receive. Good. So first two values, that is aperture and shutter speed, will have more light if you reduce the number. And if you increase the number, you will get less light. But in ISO, you have to increase the number to get more light. That's easy to remember. Cool. Now let's look at the other property of these three values. Is it just increasing or decreasing the amount of light? No, there's also more to it. So the first thing, let's just start with the aperture. So in aperture, if I keep the aperture to be, let's say, the lowest possible, which is f16 in this lens. So if I decrease the shutter speed, which means that I'll actually have to click on this up triangle to reduce the number. Okay, so you can see that the background looks more clear now. Okay, so let's compare the background with the f number 1.4 or something like that. So if I have to go to, let's say, 1.4, I will have to also adjust this number to be really high to basically get a good exposure. Okay, so now we have the exposure to be almost good, but you will see that the background looks really blurry, right? So that is the effect of having a higher aperture value. So if you want to really take good portrait photographs where you want to blur the background, give more focus to your subject, then you need to have a lens that has got the lowest number of aperture. So reducing the aperture number is going to increase the amount of light. At the same time, it is going to reduce the amount of area that can be focused. So that means your subject will stay sharp, and at the same time your background will be blurred. Now let's also look at the shutter speed thingy. What else does it have other than reducing or increasing the amount of light? Now, shutter speed is going to be the amount of time that the door opens and closes, which means if you want to take a picture of a fast moving object, then you need to have the highest possible shutter speed. Okay, so the higher the shutter speed, which means it is going to have less light, but at the same time it is going to take the photograph sharp. Well, I cannot show it right now because you need a moving object. Now the last thing is ISO. ISO is going to control the amount of light, plus it is always better to keep your ISO as low as possible, because when you have a higher ISO, you're going to introduce a lot of grains in your image, which is basically making the image unusable, right? So keep in mind, the higher the ISO, the more light it will get, but at the same time, it will also introduce a lot of noise, things that you don't want in your photograph. So try to keep as low as ISO as possible, and you can work around with the aperture and shutter speed to get the proper exposure that you need. Hope this video was useful to you guys in understanding what the exposure triangle is, and you need to have a very basic foundational idea on these 3 points to get the proper exposure for your photograph. So if you're watching all this time, I hope this is useful to you. If it was useful to you, hit the like button and share it with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notifications so that you will know when I post a new video. What's up guys, Reese here from Reese 3D. Not comfortable here. Okay, sit properly. Those signals will be passed to an image. It's basically three numbers that basically. How many times will I say basically? So what happens is the light that hits the subject from all over the world is the camera lens. The camera lens is going to receive. So inside the camera, there's an image sensor, and the image sensor is going to receive all these.